Welcome, everyone. A quick note that we are recording, and this recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and also to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and in particular to the Pamelong clan of the Wabagal people of the land in which the Callaghan campus resides and where we in the room are located today. Our speaker today, Professor Matthew Fitzpatrick, specialises in international history, in particular German and European history, as well as the history of European imperialism, German liberalism and nationalism. He is also interested in the comparative history of empires and intellectual history. He is a current holder of an Australian Research Council Future Fellowship, and his most recent monographs are The Kaiser and the Colonies, Monarchy in the Age of Empire, and Purging the Empire, Mass Expulsions in Germany, 1871 to 1914. His paper today is titled Globalisation or Empire, Revolution and the Geopolitics of Chinese Debt, 1895 to 1913. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Sasha, and thanks to the Historical, Cultural and Critical Inquiry Group for inviting me here to a Wabagal country. It's very lovely to be here whenever I can be here, and I miss this place very much. So I, of course, also tender my respects to elders past and present. And as the Ghana Mayurna people would say from back home in Ghana country, Mani Napudni, good that you are all here. This paper is an early foray into some of my research for the Future Fellowship project that I'm working on, Strategic Friendship, that looks at Anglo-German relations in the Asia-Pacific region. And I started off by having a look, I suppose, at some of the background to the economic history.
Muted.
Oh. Am I muted?
No,
No, it seems others can hear me. I beg your pardon. If that is the case, someone let me know. Yeah, so this is part of that Future Fellowship, and I'm looking at these Anglo-German relations. So I think what I'll do is, because I've got a fair bit to go through, I'll stick fairly close to a script, and if at any stage you want to ask me something or at the end, then feel free to do that. So we'll start off. Yeah, so in the Jackie Chan film 1911, the restructuring of China's debt by Western banks was held up as a cause of that year's revolution and a central point of conflict between the warring parties. Although the film's tedious and didactic historicism means that it wasn't one of Jackie Chan's most popular films, it earned an 8% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Its suggestion of the historic weightiness of China's foreign debt is, in broad terms, I would argue, closer to reality in some ways than the portrait painted by some recent business histories that have sought to minimise the extent to which foreign debts destabilise China. As the following demonstrates, China's pre-1914 economic history is properly viewed through the lens of unequal relations between the Chinese state and the combined weight of its foreign creditor banks. Additionally, the negotiation of Chinese loans prior to and after 1911 needs to be seen not through the lens of blossoming globalisation, but rather as a form of coercive international diplomacy that expressed the economic and territorial ambitions of expansion states that were working in tandem with banks. Far from being the apolitical operation of financial institutions, loan negotiations, I argue, with China were inextricably linked to the attempts by expansionist powers to secure their hegemony over China as a prelude to what they saw as a coming scramble for China, indeed one that was almost underway by that time. So in that sense, the negotiations exhibited the tendencies described as informal empire so long ago by Jack Gallagher and Ronald Robinson, and prefigured much of what in the post-war period would be called by Kwame Nkrumah neo-colonial control over the commanding heights of a vulnerable national economy. This reality, it should be said, was recognised within China, where the tactics being applied to the Chinese economy were correctly viewed as an attempt to reduce China to the type of debt peonage that had thoroughly eroded the sovereignty of states such as Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and Persia prior to the First World War. And it's a situation that Binoy Kumar Sarkar remarked was one in which, quote, the sovereignty of the Chinese Republic de facto is a thing that does not exist except in the imagination of China's patriots or in the hallucinations of the world's political idealists who do not want their pious wishes to be disturbed by the dry light of realpolitik. Now, the historiographical pendulum has swung mightily on the question of the treatment of China's state debts in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. 40 years ago, historians found it necessary to plead that surely at least some commercial considerations had played a role in what was generally seen as a primarily kind of state set of decisions regarding Chinese loans, with states using the banks to ventriloquize their foreign policy objectives. So that, in the 1970s and 80s, that was kind of seen as the primary historiographical lens. In more recent, particularly business histories, however, the notion that the foreign offices of expansion of states were central to commercial loan negotiations has entirely slipped from view in favour of a primacy of the market narrative. The fact that states view the loan negotiations as a site for the conduct of their rival Far East foreign policies, that is, has been kind of elided in favour of an argument that commercial and financial imperatives were effectively insulated from any state imperatives. So for some neo-Schumpeterian historians, the conduct of foreign banks, and in particular the multinational banking consortium that emerged in China at the time of the 1911 revolution, represents a triumph of the capacity of financial bodies to transcend nationalism and national competition in the pursuit of loftier commercial objectives. Such cosmopolitan capitalism, it has been claimed, fostered benign economic qualities within China. For Jeffrey Jones, for example, the financial institutions involved were facilitators of globalisation, working alongside states only to ensure what he calls the forcible removal of political barriers to globalisation and importing new institutions that were friendlier to attributes conducive to entrepreneurship. Under this, what I think is an overly sanguine reading of the mechanics of pre-1914 international finance, any discussion of the inequalities purposively engendered by the commercial and state representatives of global empires is seen as ahistorical and impermissible. Instead, Jones argues, those financing Chinese debt were engaged in a kind of missionary work of replacing China's anti-capitalist values with new capitalist ones. Now, with far more nuance and analytical depth, but still pushing essentially in the same direction, Ghassan Moazin has expressed doubts about the extent to which foreign banks essentially acted in congruence with and as part of the imperialist policies of foreign governments. That's a quote from Moazin. While rightly highlighting the involvement and agency of local Chinese players, Moazin arguably overcorrects by suggesting that foreign banks were apolitical instruments of economic globalisation. Rather than operating with reference to geopolitical or imperial aims, he suggests these banks sought to manage the risks of revolutionary times to ensure both China's suitability for foreign credit and their own profitability. Now, that the banks were interested in fostering political stability in China to protect their current and future business is certainly true. So too, Moazin's point that Chinese banks and intermediaries were also heavily involved in shaping the loan and the financial environment of China, for example, by extracting the lower interest rate or circumventing monopolistic loan conditions meant to restrict who they could loan from. This is all quite correct and an important insight into Chinese agency. It corresponds also to the later post-Bretton Woods history of Third World attempts to mitigate the impacts of structural adjustment programs on national sovereignty. This recognition must be tempered nonetheless by the structural fact that neither China's state nor its fragile financial sector were in any position to withstand the combined pressures of foreign banks supported by their foreign offices. So as the following shows, while the cooperation of banks across several nations with some Chinese players did offer a kind of sheen of collective zeal and cosmopolitanism, what the negotiations most obviously evince is the collaboration between banks and their governments to attach political, economic, and even geostrategic strings to China's post-revolutionary loans. In particular, if we look at the 1913 reorganisation loan. So contrary to the Schumpeterian axiom that, quote, a capitalist world can offer no fertile soil to imperialist impulses, events in pre- and post-revolutionary China demonstrate that foreign banks, as Boris Barth once wrote, were not merely politically disinterested financial entities, but instead worked hand in hand with their embassies to limit Chinese sovereignty and achieve both commercial and geopolitical goals. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background, China's financial position in the 2 decades prior to the 1911 revolution was extremely precarious and characterised by an increasing dependence on foreign loans. Now, while several loans had actually funded China's rapidly expanding railway network and attempted to shore up its infrastructure, the most profound leap into the financial dark, came when China was forced to raise enormous international loans to fund the indemnity imposed on the Chinese after the Sino-Japanese War. And it was at this point, as David J.S. King has commented, government business with the Chinese began on a larger scale, particularly for international banks such as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Company, HSBC, and the Deutsche Asiatische Bank, the DAB. The Sino-Japanese War indemnity was financed through 3 loans from foreign banks, and as collateral, China had no choice but to nominate its lucrative and politically sensitive maritime customs income. The first loan of £15.8 million was arranged by a syndicate of 6 French and 4 Russian banks. Now, with the Russian and French banks and indeed foreign officers having staked their claims early, German and British banks, in concert with their foreign officers, compacted in the London Agreement of 1895 to avoid direct competition with one another and coordinate their financial interests in China to ensure their primacy. The agreement, made on the principle of parity between the 2 banks, covered all loans and advances made to both the Chinese imperial government and any provincial governments that wanted to borrow as well. Resultingly, the second and third Sino-Japanese indemnity loans, totalling £32 million, were supplied by an Anglo-German banking cartel comprised of HSBC and the DAB. The intended result of this consortium was not, I should hasten to add, altruistic developmentalism or even merely profit, but ensuring that Russia and France would be dislodged from the centre of Chinese economic and political decision-making. So as Alice Schleven Sr. and Alice Schleven Jr. have argued, the contest for Chinese loans was fierce, and they call it a financial battle for Peking, in which banks from Britain, Germany, France and Russia viewed loans as a path to economic and political hegemony in China, particularly once fierce diplomatic battles broke out following the German seizure of territory in northern China in 1897, leading to the delineation of spheres of influence by all the powers in China. Against a backdrop where loan agreements were expressly linked to the maintenance of these spheres, as well as demands for harbour and railway concessions and external control over Chinese state finances, it was abundantly clear even before the Boxer Uprising that loan negotiations were becoming a site for imperial politics, if they ever had not been. The fiscal position of the Chinese Empire was, of course, considerably worsened by the outcome of the Boxer War, which saw the Chinese Empire saddled with yet another indemnity of roughly £67.5 million, which was an astronomical sum that was, in fact, double that was predicted by the Inspector General of Chinese Maritime Customs, Robert Hart. Arguably, the heavily inflated indemnity was, in fact, designed to be unpayable, save through loans organised by foreign banks, who in turn could then claim a need for direct control over China's finances and redirect domestic expenditure away from the provinces and into the coffers of foreign banks. Unlike loans for infrastructure, such as railway loans that were actually designed to modernise China and create the conditions for economic industrial revitalisation, these indemnity loans offered China nothing beyond a steep pathway into intergenerational debt. Far from quelling rebellious sentiment, these financial tactics led to both resistance and bitterness throughout China. So it's unsurprising, therefore, that the indemnity loans have been described in Chinese nationalist historiography as, quote, imperialist ultra-economic plunder. But even a more sober assessment of the scale of China's war indemnities raises the question of a deliberate attempt to secure indirect control of China through debt peonage, with China structurally locked into payments that had been demanded by the global coalition of armies occupying China in 1901. So after the settlement of the Boxer indemnity, but prior to the 1911 revolution, loans from foreign banks evinced both cooperation and competition amongst the powers, as well as the close involvement of the foreign officers of creditor nations vying for loans. At the same time as international competition nominally continued, the Anglo-German consortium contrived to minimise competition from other smaller consortiums based in Belgium and Austria-Hungary, often backed by their own governments who were seeking also to make inroads into China. Now, this, of course, assisted in the maintenance of Anglo-German economic dominance over China, but there was no absolute monopoly established over China's foreign debt at this time. In percentage terms, the total indebtedness of the Qing government up to 1911 was divided between Britain at 41% of the debt, Germany at 22%, France 14%, Russia 7.5%, Belgium 6.5%, and the US 3%. By 1909, the agreement between HSBC and the DAB was also coming under attack from players outside the consortium looking to either compete or to join this group of two. And for reasons of political expediency, the group sought to placate protests from France and the US by expanding to include the Banque de l'Indochine in May 1909 and a US group headed by JP Morgan in November 1910, thereby creating the Group of Four consortium. And this obviously was unpopular in Germany, in particular in Britain, with the Financial Times regretting the loss of the days when, quote, an agreement between the English and the German banks was sufficient to bring about a community of interest in the matter of lending. But as the Financial Times also observed, the growing capacity of the consortium to penetrate the commanding heights of the Chinese economy did not go unnoticed inside China, with the government increasingly wary of and even hostile towards the foreign banks' behaviour, particularly cartel behaviour. As one HSBC official in Peking commented in December of 1910, quote, the Chinese fear any form of international control which might result in a state of financial tutelage similar to Egypt. This fear was repeated in April 1912 when the Chinese complained that they were in danger of being reduced to the type of debt dependency that characterised Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and Persia. Now, such fears weren't unfounded. By the time of the revolution of 1911, it was, as Frank H.H. King argued, apparent to any observer surveying the role of the maritime customs that, quote, it had become primarily a debt collection agency for foreign creditors. By November of 1911, the DAB was even formally suggesting that it was time for the HSBC, DAB and the Russo-Asiatic Bank to act formally as a troika trust that would fully control the maritime customs body so as to ensure that the Boxer indemnity loans will be paid prior to any internal domestic expenditure within China. Now, during the revolution itself, in which the Qing dynasty that had ruled since 1644 was overthrown and replaced by a new republic, the cash-strapped Chinese government saw itself as having no choice but to look for further loans to help it win the war. It approached the DAB in October 1911 to see whether the bank would buy $5 million worth of government bonds, which it could then use to buy weapons. Sensing an opportunity, the DAB initially decided it would raise the loan on the proviso that the Chinese buy the weapons they needed from Germany, probably from Krupp. Just 3 days later, but however, the bank decided that the DAB decided it would fall in line with a policy that was emerging from the HSBC, which was to stop all lending in China until the revolution was over. This came from the pressure of their merchants in the south, who were very concerned that if the revolutionaries won the war, then they would be seen as having been on the wrong side of history, and all further loans to the new revolutionary government would be stopped. So this is not a kind of question of altruism or wanting to stay out of conflict, but a pragmatic desire to avoid alienating any future Chinese government for having been seen to having assisted domestic enemies earlier on. This decision was also endorsed by the foreign officers of both Britain and Germany. And there's something I want to stress, that at every step of the way, the banks and the foreign officers are talking very closely about what the next step should be. And the banks also made sure that when it came time to loan again, that they would only do so when the Foreign Office said that it was safe to do so. So Charles Addis of HSBC, for example, is writing to Franz Urbig of the DAB, and both of them agree that they have to wait for the foreign officers before they start loaning again. Now, the revolution is very damaging for business, and the DAB report for 1911 makes that very, very clear. What's interesting, however, is that caught up in the economic downturn are all of the kind of Chinese compradors and local Chinese banks that the DAB and HSBC are working with, many of whom simply become insolvent during the crisis. And we see a real, I suppose, what in the 1980s would have been called a rationalisation of the Chinese banking sector, where effectively you see almost 50% of Chinese banks simply fail. And then by the time you get to the 1920s, around 75% of Chinese banks have failed. And also the Chinese government was forced into arrears of some £2 million sterling. And according to Yuan Shikai, the Chinese treasury was so empty that the Empress Dowager had instructed him to use her jewellery to clear some of China's debt. So they're really at the last of their finances. Now, to the eyes of the international banks and China's government under Yuan Shikai, the most practical solution to China's looming insolvency was a new reorganisation loan totalling £60 million sterling. To its detractors, however, within China, particularly those who are on the other side of the revolution, it was yet another step towards debt peonage. And kind of anteceding Naomi Klein's concept of disaster capitalism, where orchestrated raids on the public sector occurred in the wake of catastrophic events, the restructure and consolidation of Chinese public debt fell to the group of four led by HSBC and the DAB. Like the Sino-Japanese War and the Boxer War, the revolution presented an opportunity for foreign banks to win high-yielding loans underwritten by increased control over China's primary assets, including railway lines, as well as the salt gabelle and the most importantly, the maritime customs income. So at a meeting on March 12 of 1912, high-ranking representatives of the group of four, including Addis and Urbig of HSBC and DAB, met in London to discuss how best to restructure China's debt. The meeting started from the position that the revolution had necessitated the complete reorganisation of the system of government, including demobilisation of troops and a bureaucratic restructure. And the banks argued that they, the group of four, were in the best position to do that. And to ensure they had political cover, they also agreed that it was of, quote, the utmost importance that governments of the group should give their support to the negotiations. Now, pushing beyond this general support, Addis of HSBC also sought British Foreign Office support for the position that the British government, quote, will not support any other group in making loans or advances to China, but will confine their exclusive support to the British group as signatories of the intergroup agreement. That is to say, they would have a loaning monopoly. And this upset particularly HSBC's rival, the Eastern Bank, when they were told by the Foreign Office that the railway loans they were pursuing would not be supported by the Foreign Office. But the British government didn't waver, and they maintained their support for this kind of the monopoly of the consortium right up until the 1913 actual signing of the agreement. And indeed, the Foreign Office of Britain told the Eastern Bank that they were, quote, acting in accordance with both the German and French governments on this issue. So that is to say, broad agreement in the capitals of Europe that the consortium would have a monopoly over Chinese loans. They also agreed at this point, for the same reasons of kind of pressure, and I'll go into these in a moment, that the group of four would become the group of six when they were lobbied by the governments of Russia and Japan to allow in the Russo Asiatic Bank and the Yokohama Specie Bank from Japan. Now, for the Japanese and the Russians, the decision of whether to join the group of four had not been straightforward. The issue had come to a head when both powers had expressed their outrage at Article 16 of the Currency Loan Agreement of April 1911, another loan that was being looked at the time, which had bound the Chinese government to offer first preference for any future loans to the group of four, effectively locking out the Japanese and the Russians from all further loan agreements. And the Japanese saw this as particularly contentious, not only for kind of financial reasons, but most dangerously because they thought that this would allow the group of four consortium to control railway loans in an area that they saw as clearly within their sphere of influence, namely southern Manchuria. And the Russians too demanded a route to participation, whether through open competition, so that is getting rid of Article 16, or by clearing the path for them to joining the group of four. Now, the German Foreign Office was steadfastly against this, as was the DAB, as late as May of 1911. The Russians joining the group of four was simply unthinkable, given that every child, they said, knew of Russia's predatory interests in China and the lack of ethical scruples of the Russians. And so too Urbig of the DAB viewed this as a kind of a political fix by particularly the British, the French and the Americans, who were concerned to have the Russians inside the consortium rather than doing damage from outside of the consortium. So the bargaining between the banks, supported by the respective governments, gets underway with this group of six. And it's fair to say that the negotiations are very stiff and very blunt. By March 1912, it was clear that reorganisation loan will be conditional on the kind of reforms in the Chinese economy that after Bretton Woods would be called a structural adjustment program. As Urbig explained it, quote, "We believe that there is danger that China will ruin herself unless she is taken in hand properly by the six powers." And the consortium insisted on a monopoly over future Chinese loans, as I've already mentioned, and perhaps most galling to the Chinese, that foreign officials would be employed who would take over direct management of the Chinese government's primary revenue streams, namely China's maritime customs and its salt gabelle. The Chinese government was also instructed to employ bank-approved foreign officials to monitor, quote, "the proper expenditure of the reorganisation loan funds." So the loan itself will be managed by foreigners, and indeed the finances and the budget of the Chinese empire would be organised by foreigners as well. And in addition to this, all Chinese accounts and expenditure will be then regularly audited by foreign experts. Now, the banks ensured that they had their respective Foreign Office approval for these conditions. And to this end, a formal diplomatic note was issued to China by Foreign Minister Grey of Britain and supported by Germany, reiterating the necessity of submitting to the bank's economic controls over Chinese government expenditure before any loan would be forthcoming. The demands for foreign surveillance and control over all spending and the implementation of agreed upon reforms met with strong opposition from the Chinese, with officials refusing with, quote, "visible outrage" to the conditions. The Chinese also declared that such coercive terms voided any earlier commitment to work only with the group of six. But the banks and their diplomatic representatives remained adamant that without these conditions, the loan would not go ahead. And by the 20th of May 1912, Chinese officials, who were still deeply unhappy but had little choice, accepted the restrictive conditions. The consequences of this was widespread discontent in China and renewed after this discontent official reluctance. One southern Chinese general saw in the conditions, quote, "the death of China," and urged refusal, resistance, and the replacement of the loan with donations from the Chinese people instead. Now, as the Chinese were inching closer to agreeing to the intrusive economic conditions that would become almost normalised after World War II in some ways, the tenor of negotiations for the reorganisation loan within the six-group consortium shifted towards a consideration of the inclusion of other loan conditions, namely territorial claims. Some of these claims were so extravagant as to not only alienate the Chinese government, but also fracture the attempts of the sixth group to reach a consensus position before forwarding conditions to the Chinese. And by early 1912, it became apparent that the strategy of including Russia and Japan in the consortium as a kind of means of tempering their territorial demands was not working. Rather, the Russians were trying to further their claims of special interests in parts of China while using recognition of post-revolutionary Chinese government as a bargaining chip. So if you don't go along these conditions, then we don't recognise the government, which means the government can't get any loans at all. At the same time, Japan saw in the actions of the original Group of Four a similar impediment to their own plans to dominate Manchuria. Given in mind what's happened in Korea in 1910, that's something that should be kept in mind. Rumours abounded of Japan deliberately destabilising the region and mobilising 10,000 troops in January of 1912 also kind of heightened issues. Initially, the inclusion of political dimensions within the loan conditions was kind of accepted by both the British and the Germans as kind of a normal part of the process. So when the Japanese sent verbal notes to European capitals to sound out their support, I'll just take my jacket off actually. When the Japanese sent verbal notes to European capitals to sound out their support for withholding recognition until their rights and interests had been recognised, they agreed that is to say the Germans and the British agreed that the powers had to work together to ensure confirmation of those rights, privileges and immunities. Within a month, however, the other powers had become more guarded as Russia and Japan's proposals became more concrete. In March 1912, the Japanese Foreign Office informed the other powers that it expected the new consortium would take into consideration Japan's interests in southern Manchuria. And the German Foreign Office replied that they knew nothing of such special rights in China, and the Japanese reiterated their claim, and the Germans said that they would recognise any written agreement between Japan or Russia with the Chinese government, but nothing else. So that is to say they couldn't start making simple claims willy-nilly. They had to have agreement with the Chinese government beforehand. Russia too made it clear that other consortium members could not compete for railway contracts in regions it considered to be within its sphere of influence, namely northern Manchuria, Mongolia and Turkestan, or indeed that loan funds, they said that no loan funds could be used to upgrade military installations or railways in these areas either. And this was in line with Russia's demand in January 1912 that in any post-revolutionary order, China would relinquish Mongolia to become, if not a Russian protectorate, then at the very least an independent pro-Russian buffer state with no Chinese troops permitted to enter. And there is some support for that in Mongolia, and we can talk about that perhaps later on if people are interested. But the long and the short of it is that Russia says that without recognition of their control over Mongolia, there will be no consortium loan. And indeed, they demanded recognition of their primacy, as I've said, in Manchuria, Mongolia and Turkestan. Now, to be clear, territorial claims on China were far from unknown to the consortium. Indeed, Germany had, of course, secured its own mainland colony in 1897, and Russia and Japan too had been making inroads into Chinese territory as well. The British, for their part, had been making clear that they consider themselves as having special rights and interests in Tibet, and the French were doing the same in Yunnan. This is actually the difficulty when you use British and French archives, is that they kind of don't talk about their own claims. So it takes a bit more excavation to find out what's going on with the British in Tibet and the French in Yunnan. But nonetheless, their claims are there as well. But it was the bluntness, rather than the claims itself, it's the bluntness of these demands in the context of loan discussions that troubled the Group of Four, which viewed such considerations as kind of assumed political background rather than something that you physically inked into the contractual terms of the loan. So as Foreign Secretary Grey in London insisted, the appearance of maintaining an arm's length from what were unmistakably political conditions was important for the banks, even as they worked closely with their respective governments towards both commercial and political objectives. So it's a question of being unseemly in some ways. So what was apparent by May 1912 was that rather than protecting established spheres of influence or historical rights and privileges, Russia and Japan were making big new claims in a forum preserved for more subtle economic diplomacy. And in June 1912, the matter remained unresolved and an urgent meeting was called to try and fix this. It didn't work. And the Russians and Japanese insisted that if a loan was used for purposes with which they disagreed, they would leave the consortium. Effectively, that is insisting upon a veto right upon any future Chinese expenditure before it occurred. And at this point, it looks like the Group of Four, ex-Group of Four, is starting to look for ways to dislodge the Russians and the Japanese. At the same time, of course, the political backdrop to the loan process was worsening, with Russian and Japanese territorial plans so advanced by July of 1912 that the Manchester Guardian was predicting the imminent dismemberment of China. In September and October of 1912, the situation in Mongolia threatened to turn into open warfare. Meanwhile, the Japanese complained of ongoing cooperation between the Russians and the British to secure their interests in Mongolia and Tibet, respectively, without due consideration for Japan's interests in Manchuria. Indeed, the Russians were openly declaring their support for the independence of the Mongolians and their preparedness to defend that. And at the same time, the British are openly expressing their disapproval of China's attempt to reintegrate Tibet into the fledgling republic, given what they saw as British interests and treaty rights. And by January of 1913, the Times of London is warning that, quote, Great Britain will not recognise the republic unless an undertaking is given that the autonomy of Tibet will be respected. Autonomy of Tibet means, of course, that under the tutelage of British India. This lack of recognition, of course, had its own implications for government-raised loans. So under mounting pressure from all sides, the Chinese government carried out their threat of May 1912 and sought out other lenders. They tried first with an independently minded German bank operating outside the DAB group, and the Chinese eventually succeeded in signing a loan for £10 million offered by a multinational consortium brought together by the London stockbroker Charles Birch Crisp. The reaction to this surprise development was telling. Both the group of six and their respective foreign offices were activated, with the banks insisting to no avail that the Chinese government cancel the Crisp loan and agree to the terms and conditions that they'd placed on their loan offer. So too, protests emanated from the British Foreign Office, with Gray pointing out that just as Britain could only support the group of six, so too, quote, China is not free to contract any loans outside the six-power group. China rejected the argument, arguing that kind of vetoing outside loans must inevitably result in the ruin of China. And Crisp, for his part, the lead of the kind of, if you like, this new consortium, he was brought into the Foreign Office, given a dressing down, and told in no uncertain terms that he could expect no support from the British government in securing his loan in China. At this point, the Chinese tried to break off negotiations with the group of six and say that their conditions are too unreasonable, particularly the requirements for control over their revenue streams. And they said unless the banks rethought their unbending attitude, the rupture in negotiations was to be considered final. And in the British Foreign Office, they decided that perhaps what they might do to bring the Chinese around was simply call in their earlier debts from China, effectively destroying the Chinese economy. By the beginning of 1913, China's need for further funds to cover the Boxer indemnity loan became acutely apparent, and they came back to the negotiating table now for a loan of £25 million. And at this point, the group of six again splinters, this time over the question, and I won't go into it in detail here, over who these foreign officials who are going to be in control of Chinese finances are going to be, what nation states they are going to be from. There's much talk about who's to blame for this. The French say it's the Germans say it's the Russians, and the Russians and the British say the Russians are playing for time because they think that actually the Chinese state is going to declare bankruptcy, and then all bets are off and the scramble for China will ensue. But in the final stage of negotiations, relations between the six powers break down so badly that it looks like actually HSBC and DAB are going to go back to a group of two solution and fund the loan by themselves. That doesn't happen. What does happen, however, is that the overt rapaciousness of the consortium's members had come under public attack in the United States. And when you have the shift from a Taft presidency to a Wilson presidency, you see a concomitant shift in China policy. Wilson made clear that the new US government, quote, did not approve of the terms of the loan offered by the group of six, and that, quote, the conditions of the loan seem to us to touch very nearly the administrative independence of China itself. Consequently, Wilson stated his government would not take part in a loan which would represent, quote, forcible interference in the financial and even the political affairs of that great Oriental state. The loss of US state support for the loan and the group of six conditions left the consortium's US group under JP Morgan no choice but to withdraw with regret and mortification, as they write. By the time the so-called reorganisation loan for £25 million was finalised on the 26th of April of 1913, it was offered by the group of five, consisting of HSBC, the DAB, Banque de l'Indochine, Russo-Asiatic Bank, and the Yokohama Specie Bank. It went ahead against a backdrop of continuing French and Russian protests who, again, are playing for time in this situation. And indeed, these Franco-Russian objections would be maintained right up until World War One. When World War One came about, they were very eager, very early on, to expel the German group entirely from the consortium, and indeed to eradicate the German presence in Asia altogether. Interestingly, however, the British HSBC, particularly Charles Addis, dragged their feet, and Addis is kind of definitive on the point that he wants Anglo-German cooperation in China to endure irrespective of World War One. So he writes to his Foreign Office and says, quote, "Personally, I do not believe it is a good policy to crush Germany. Our quarrel is with the German government, not with the German people. Our aim is to destroy German militarism, not to prey on private property. When the war is over, we will shake hands and be friends again." But in the end, his Foreign Office tells him that he has to liquidate all German assets in China. That's another paper. Now, the proceeding, this is my conclusion, the proceeding has argued 3 points regarding Chinese debt, particularly in relation to the 1911 to 1913 reorganisation loan and negotiations. The first is that the process of negotiating loans for China was firmly linked to imperial politics. The foreign banks were far from benign and apolitical instruments of globalisation that coaxed the Chinese out of insular economic and political policies. Instead, they operated in tandem with their foreign offices to ensure that their political aims were achieved in China. This is true of British concerns over Tibet, France over Yunnan, Russia in Mongolia, Japan in Manchuria, and indeed the whole debate about which foreign officials are going to control the maritime customs and the salt gabelle, etc. In addition, the demands to curb China's sovereignty over expenditure and the structuring and direction of state revenues, these were all self-evidently political interventions that, as I've said, look a lot like structural adjustment programs. The second point is that there was no unanimity of purpose among the group of six, which was held together largely by a fear of the economic and political costs of being outside the consortium. For the Russians and the Japanese, the concerns related to how future loans might affect regions of China they considered to be within their sphere of influence. For those within the group of four, the pressure related more to the desire to control the actions of other powers in China. The closest thing to a constant, however, was Anglo-German cooperation on all of these matters. And finally, the third point is that the Chinese were anything but silent partners in the loan negotiations, as Muazzin has pointed out in his recent book. Just as other decolonised countries would in the post-war period, when faced with the demands for structural adjustment loan conditions imposed by the World Bank and the IMF, the Chinese negotiated fiercely on the question of the rate of interest, the use of the loan, the question of foreign control over the commanding heights of state revenue, and their freedom to strike loans with whomever they so pleased, irrespective of the monopolising ambitions of the group of six. In much of this, however, they were thwarted by the dire economic straits they were in after 2 decades of warfare, revolution, and in particular, foreign indemnity, debt, peonage. And I'll finish there. So thank you once again for having me.
Thank you, Matt, for an absolutely fascinating paper. Can I invite questions from the audience? And I might leap in first and take shameless advantage of my position as chair. I was really struck by the fact that we've got Russia making loans to China, in fact, banging down the door to make loans to China, because if I can sort of use world systems theory for a second, Russia is a peripheral state, par excellence, right? I mean, it's and totally dependent on France, or predominantly dependent on France for its loans. So presumably these loans are being made with the permission of France, because that's where ultimately the capital is going on. To what extent is, but also you point to the fact that Russia becomes the odd one out, or one of the awkward squad in making these demands. So to what extent is Russia's action an extension of French interests as well? And to what extent is Russia driving the show there?
Yeah. So this is a really important question, because you're right, Russia it doesn't have the capital to raise the kind of loan that the British and the French, the British, French and the Germans are capable of raising. And indeed, one of the sticking points for negotiations between the group of six is the Russians want to list their portion of the loan on the French, British, and German stock exchanges, and the British and the French say no, partly because they're already a bit wary about the Russians being involved, and they can see that this is a political claim by the Russians, that they demand that they be at the table, as it were. And this has a lot to do with Russia's Far East strategy that comes out from Sergei Witte and the Trans-Siberian Railway, which is going to come down through Mongolia, effectively, and into China proper. So Russia, as we saw very early on in the paper, Russia and France are working very closely together to try and steal a march on the British and the Germans, and thereafter they work quite closely with the French. But they quickly, interestingly enough, given their strategic rivalry with Japan, they throw their lot in with Japan primarily because of Manchuria, and the idea that the Japanese will support their territorial ambitions and vice versa. So you're quite right. The Russians can't afford to be at the table, but they demand to be there. So it's France are deeply involved in that. Whether they're a peripheral state according to world systems theory, I'd have to think about a little more. Certainly, Witte has read Friedrich List. He knows about this kind of core and periphery, and the Russians are determined to be a core, not somebody else's periphery. And they indeed see Manchuria, Mongolia, Turkestan as part of that claim, as well as, of course, using Pan-Slavism for the simple purposes.
Although that claim to be a big boy at the table really seems to rest on their military rather than their economic strength.
Absolutely, but this is why again, Witte reads Friedrich List, and that's why he suddenly starts building railways everywhere, because he understands that the key to being a core state is to become effectively the place where surplus goes to rest, and you do that by becoming the marketplace. Whether Russia is well suited for that is another question. Sure. But they want to be. Sorry, there was a question on there too. But yes, come on.
Okay, thank you. I want to introduce myself briefly. First of all, my name is Umit Kurt, so I'm a ERC Dicker Fellow.
Right.
So it's thank you for your presentation. It was quite compelling, actually. I just want to jump to the conclusion.
Yeah.
I was wondering what was the reaction or response of Chinese agency to all these external, not even supervision, it's a control, not even a pressure, the control over Chinese fiscal policy. What were the reactions of different sections of society in China at that point, or the Chinese political or social elites at the time?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, if you watch the Jackie Chan film, he'll say, "Oh, look, it's the loans sparked the revolution," and it's not quite that simple. But it's certainly the case that, particularly in the South, this is seen as prior to the revolution. It's seen as a reason why they have to overthrow the Qing dynasty, because they have become so enthralled to the Western powers, to these banks, that they do have to move on. Now, afterwards, I mean, there is a financial sector that has their interests firmly linked to these banks. So the compradors, the Chinese banks that parlay these loans into actual actions on the ground. I mean, their interests are, of course, served by having capital flows into the country. So there is a thin veneer of those in the financial sector who do very well, except to the point where 1911 breaks out, and then many of them go bankrupt, and the others that don't go bankrupt are the ones who are directly supported by the foreign banks. Wan Shikai he's read the books, and he has been reading the books for a long time. He understands that the Chinese economy is on its knees, and that they don't have the domestic capital to finance their overseas commitments. Now, during the revolution, they make a very clear commitment early on in the revolution that they will honour the loan commitments made by the imperial government. They do this because they don't want foreign interference, because, of course, if the revolutionaries say we are not going to pay the debts racked up by the emperor, then then you have the Boxer War replayed, where you have the British, the French, the Germans, and everyone come in and protect their investment as well as their bankers. And there is an element of risk for the bankers themselves, particularly in the South. And that's why the British are so clear about the question of neutrality, because many of their bankers who are in the South are saying, listen, the only reason we're safe is because we're staying out of it. And if we start loaning money to the imperial government, then we may find ourselves with our heads on pikes. So, let alone the collapse of all banking in that region. So, there is a begrudging acceptance of the fact that they're in a very difficult situation. The cause of this difficult situation, of course, is the indemnity loans. And somebody asked a question about the indemnity loans. These are when the Sino-Japanese War and the Boxer War, the Chinese are compelled to pay astronomical sums. And of course, they can't pay them domestically. The only way they can pay that is by raising loans to pay it off over time. So they pay off the indemnities kind of in a lump sum, so to speak, and then they pay off the bank. So in fact, what they're paying year over year is not the reparations themselves. They're paying off the loan for the reparations. And this is this is the thing that sticks in the craw, and which in some ways it's poor politics amongst everything else. I mean, ethical questions aside, it's poor politics in the sense that it does not allow China to use capital investment for the creation of the modern infrastructure it requires to maintain its territorial and political sovereignty. It can't do that any longer. So it has to. So instead, all of the money goes out the door just to pay off. The debt is an implied one, and one that is simply handed to them for having lost the war.
Thank you. Just following up on that, you said poor politics. Is that poor politics by the Chinese, by the Western powers, by?
I mean, by the Western powers in the sense that well, it depends on, I suppose. If you're Russia, of course, this makes perfect sense because, I mean, at least, I haven't read the Russian archives, so I can't be sure on this. And I can speak freely because no one will be getting into the Russian archives for about 50 years. But what everybody else is saying about the Russians is that they have most to gain by the dissolution of the Chinese state in toto. The British and the Germans don't want this for a number of reasons. The British, why would we want that? Because we control the Yangtze Basin, we control Hong Kong, we control trade across most of China anyway. So all that can happen is we can lose control of some of those. And the Germans too feel that they can only lose in some ways. The French are hopeful that they can make inroads through the back door of Indochina through Yunnan. But that said, the politics of the Russian state appears to be more predicated on really taking parcels of land and turning it into Russian land or buffer states that are answerable to Russia. Now, in some ways, the British are less interested in that, although they do some of that because they've already done it. The Germans are less interested in that because they've already done that. So that is to say that they feel that they've got they are, to quote Bismarck, a sated power in that region. But the Japanese and the Russians do not. The poor politics comes in for particularly the British and the British and the Germans, who want to maintain some semblance of the status quo. And that is to say, they want to maintain a Chinese state. And you do that by allowing it to create the infrastructure that's required. And in that sense, it's not too dissimilar to the situation of the Ottoman Empire, where we have a similar situation where Russia is very concerned about areas. But again, there too, you have the British have already claimed their territory. They've got their Cyprus. They've got Egypt.
That makes sense. Nancy.
Thank you so much. What an interesting paper about an area about which I know very, very little. So I'll try not to ask any deeply ignorant questions or try to make parallels with research that I do. But I just picked up on your comment then that you hadn't gone into the Russian archive, and I wondered what's the situation with regard to access to Chinese records for their perspective on all of this, I guess both linguistically and in terms of regulations around access?
No, it's a good question, and I'm hoping to get to China and work with the Chinese research assistant at some stage, but that's a kind of a watch this space area. In some ways, a lot of the hard yards and the hard work has been done by Ghassan Muazzin, who's based in Hong Kong, who's looked very closely at the Chinese records, and it's one of those interesting situations where the detail of what he's written about and the sources that he's marshalled, I agree with all of that. Our disagreement, I think, comes at the next level when we then interpret what that means. And understandably, I've been involved in some of this myself with other work elsewhere. He's very keen to point to the agency of the Chinese, and I don't doubt that for a second. I mean, they are extremely heavily involved in it, and all of my sources show HSBC and DAB going back to their foreign offices and saying, the Zhongli Yamen and other bodies within China have angrily denounced what we want to do. But the thing that always what happens is that at the end of that process, the Chinese are brought back to the table and accept the conditions that have been placed upon them. They do get a lower rate of interest than they would have got. They are able to get some loans, some smaller, more modest loans from other consortia, which means that they don't maintain the absolute monopoly that the Group of Six want. So the Chinese are active in that space. And in the end, the Group of Six, after the reorganisation loan, so after 1913, and particularly after World War I, the concession that the Group of Six, which is now the Group of Five, which after Germany goes out is now a different group altogether, they can see that they have to split up between a monopoly over government lending and free competition for what they call commercial loans, so upgrading of ports, upgrading of railways. But if those loans are being raised by provincial governments or the Chinese government, there's still the expectation that HSBC will certainly be there, not so much DAB at this stage. So yes, the Chinese are definitely involved very heavily, and they're in the longer version of some of this, I've got there are a lot more Chinese names angrily protesting, but when cutting the paper, it's quite telling that you see actually that these are moments of resistance, but not always successful moments of resistance.
Not effective ones. Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, I've got a quick question. So is this a case of the original four trying to get sort of exclusive access to these revenue streams, turning to governments to assure their primacy in position, and then governments trying to insert a little too much influence into the process, and then that kind of derailing it?
Yeah, no, that in some ways is the nub of the question, the extent to which, I came to this with a macro question: what is the relationship between state and capital? And the short answer is that it varies over time, because when capital doesn't need the state, they say, hey, stay out of our business. This is a purely commercial enterprise. But for the majority of the time, particularly out on the periphery, they need the state. And so from early on, there is a real sense that initially that they can certainly rely upon their respective foreign offices to assist them in maintaining the kind of the monopoly over the loan. Where the Group of Four governments probably go further than the HSBC and DAB, who are really the leaders of the Group of Four, are happy with, is with the inclusion of Russia and Japan. But it is a vexed question, because the ultimate assessment, and the banks come begrudgingly to the same conclusion, is that Russia and Japan will do far more damage outside of the consortium, because they'll just simply annex territory, raise loans willy-nilly under punitive conditions that they know the Chinese can't pay, declare bankruptcy, and try and kind of, really sort of effectively destroy the status quo that they depend upon for their own offices. So there is an acceptance of the need to have Russia and Japan there, but from the get-go, it becomes very apparent that this is extremely difficult, precisely because from the Russian and the Japanese perspective, they say, oh, great, we've got four other powers who will now assist us in our attempts to control the commanding heights of the Chinese economy and to assist us in ensuring that we can get the territory that we see as strategically important.
Just a quick follow-up question. I mean, in comparison to the Ottoman case, especially within the framework of the establishment of Ottoman Public Debt Administration.
Yes.
So we have the same kind of external control over the Ottoman economy and fiscal policies. But in the Ottoman context, it kind of gave rise to make reforms and restructuring the economy and other modern infrastructure to keep pace with the past and fulfill their responsibilities in their rights and so on and so forth. Have you encountered the same kind of proclivity in Chinese case?
So the difference here in some ways is indemnities. So the Ottoman isn't servicing loans that don't create any infrastructure necessarily. So you're quite right. In fact, I mean, I think the Ottoman Empire, given that it looks like debt tutelage to everybody else, they actually are quite successful in turning that into hard infrastructure, railways, ports, restructuring of the administration. The closer example is Egypt, where they are incapable of. I mean, effectively, as you know, Egypt becomes effectively a British state, and that's kind of where the Russians want to head with this, and the British feel that they've already got what they need, not Tibet notwithstanding, but that they think they've already got that kind of hegemony that they require. But the Ottoman case is a little different because they do have enormous loans, but those loans are used to build things that help modernise the Ottoman state, and that's not quite the same. There are railway loans. If China had only to pay off its railway loans, and there are enormous bank ledgers with all of the loans that China's got, and you look at the size of the railway loans and the port loans and all, they're actually quite modest in comparison to the kind of indemnity loans that they're being saddled with, and there is a difference there.
I mean, my point, I entirely agree. All these processes and developments awaken or evoke kind of consciousness in Ottoman political elites to create independent, modern, restructured economic model. So I was wondering if there was the same kind of pattern of thinking.
Oh no, and afterwards, and particularly once you move into the post-revolutionary era,
after 1911.
Then you start to see some of this. But again, I mean, those loans don't necessarily go away. I mean, until we get to the kind of the communist period in some ways.
It's the same. It's in Turkey until 1950s.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you can see this everywhere with indemnity loans. I remember the bugbear of the Germans after World War I is that 1980s is when we're going to pay off this last war, and there's an outrage about that. We digress.
We have come up to the end of our allotted time, so please join me in thanking Matt for a fascinating paper. That was absolutely brilliant. Before you go, a quick reminder that our next seminar is on Friday the 24th of March and is co-hosted by the Gender Research Network here at UON. Our presenter will be Dr. Paula Jane Byrne on the topic Women and Intellectual Life in New South Wales, Rose Selwyn. And thank you all. Hope to see you then. And for those of you who are located in Newcastle, I wish you luck in dodging the race cars that are zooming around the city this weekend. And yeah, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.